Hello, good afternoon. We're going to get started. As you probably know from your agendas, we're here for 30 minutes today, which is a pretty ambitious amount of time to try to cover off the question, as we enter a new era of globalization, how will the world's great powers adjust to a changing landscape? But we're going to try. And in fact, to increase the ante, I've asked each of our panelists to summarize today's geopolitical landscape and the shifts in one word or phrase. So I'm making it even more difficult for them. But while they think a little bit about that question, I'll briefly introduce them. So to my far left, Professor Jiang Yuechun, Director, the Department of the World Economy and Development Studies, China Institute of International Studies, which for those of you who may not know is a very well-respected think tank, which is also very closely affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. On his right, Senator Peter Harder, Senator from Ontario, Canada, who first came to China in 1980 and has been here 30 times since, but certainly has seen a lot of change in this country and will also speak to changes in his own country in Canada. And lastly, but not least, Minister Pradeep Kumar Gyawali, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nepal, who will also certainly bring us a new perspective as we think about geopolitical shifts. We should really be very focused on the fact this is not a question of one country or two countries, but many, many different countries navigating a shifting geopolitical landscape. So if I may also ask everyone in the room to use your headsets, if you don't have one yet, because Professor Jiang will speak in Chinese. And I think this is a great opportunity to also take advantage of the location of our meeting today here in Dalian, China. We are in a bilingual or multilingual environment, and it's a good reminder also that language is an important part of the trust building that will be needed to navigate a shifting geopolitical landscape. So English on channel 1. Professor Jiang, please, have you thought of a single word or phrase that you think would describe today's shifting geopolitical landscape?
Well, there is a shifting relations, and there is a big change of the big powers. I would say that's the landscape of geopolitics in the world, and it's a typical picture.
Rebecca, you've given us a big challenge to sum it up in one word. If I could have one word, I would say good. And if you gave me two words, I'd say not good. I'm happy to explain.
Minister.
Very difficult to confine in few words. I may say very complex, unpredictable, and more challenging for the countries like us who critically require the rule-based and predictable global system.
Excellent. So I'm going to give the audience an even more difficult challenge. You can't use any words. So can you raise your hand if you're more on the side of good? One hand, 2, 3, 4. And more on the side of complex or not good, if you were allowed 2 words. Okay, so clearly concerns in the room. And you wouldn't be far off from the views of those who answered the World Economic Forum's most recent global risk report, in which 91% expected economic confrontation between major powers in 2019, and 88% expected an erosion of multilateral trading rules and agreements to come this year. So perhaps not surprising given that the tone was already set in the last 2 years, but certainly the challenge for our panelists today, I believe, is to add something new to something that has been debated extensively over the past 2 years. This shift is not something new that we haven't noticed. The media has certainly also paid very close attention to it and brought a lot of light to the discussion, but to some degree also a lot of darkness. So if I were to ask the three of you to particularly speak to our audience here in Dalian, an audience which is perhaps not looking for a new grand theory of geopolitics, but rather a question of what do we do despite geopolitics? What can we do as entrepreneurs, as scientists, or as entrepreneurs but in the field of the public sector or the social sector? How do we continue to move forward and to make progress despite these shifts? So if I might also first ask the question, it seems we all agree that the world is shifting, and we're moving away from a global consensus building and a more multilateral institution-driven world towards one that is a more competitive and bilateral-driven environment. So we at the forum call this the shift from a rules-based order to a deals-based order. So if I could ask again, perhaps Professor Jiang to speak from China's view, in the view of, from China, what is the potential impact in China of such a shift? From a rules-based order to a deals-based order.
Here is my thinking. There is a big impact to China and to the world at large as well. However, in this great shifting, I would say, I summarize it with one word. It's cooperation. The key word is cooperation. Given the drastic changes in the world, we must agree that we are depending on each other more and more, and that's the trend. If we only focus on the interests of one country, that's not a good way to go. We must go through consultation, find a way of cooperation that would be beneficial for all countries, because we would like to achieve win-win situations in the end.
Thank you very much. And in this morning's plenary, for those of you who were able to attend, Premier Li did very much reference the fact that China is certainly in favor of continued globalization and as well reform of the multilateral institutions such as the WTO, which are currently helping lead that multilateral order. Senator, what is your view from Canada?
Well, I want to inject a bit of optimism before I obviously have to recognize the fevered nature of geopolitics today. But in the overall arc of history, let's not focus on a particular episodic deal-making approach of, shall we say, one administration. But let's look at how we have, in fact, modernized and are modernizing the multilateral institutions of the post-war era. GATT reform led to WTO. WTO reform is still alive. I know the Premier spoke to that this morning. Certainly from a Canadian perspective, having global institutions that establish the rules and have a capacity to adjudicate difference is a heck of a lot better than having large powers seek to renegotiate and make deals. So the rules-based institutions are hugely important for a country like Canada. And I would note that even in this era that is somewhat fevered, we have concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union. We have concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, not with all the partners that started, but nonetheless progress is being made. That as shaky as the Paris Agreement on climate change is, a number of us are committing ourselves to fulfilling our obligations on climate. And young people are engaged in having their governments commit to those targets, and making the commitments is not easy. That we know we have to do more in other areas. President Macron's initiative on artificial intelligence ought to be recognized and pointed out, so that we are paradoxically living in an era where the institutions of multilateralism are being attacked as being inadequate for our time, while we're adding new institutions and new issues for the institutions to deal with. And that's a tremendous challenge. Let's also remember that when we built those institutions, more than half the population of the world wasn't included. And we are now experiencing the challenge of global institutions that are in fact more global, and therefore power has to adjust to that reality.
So an important reminder that multilateral doesn't have to mean unanimous. It's still, the cooperation is taking place on a very large scale, but it's simply the withdrawal or the maybe public objection of a few key players, which is leading to casting doubt on those institutions, but actually new ones are springing up in the place of old ones that are perhaps diminishing. That's very interesting. Minister, what's your view?
Those challenges are being more complex. Still, I am optimistic because the multilateralism was the outcome of the endeavors by our pioneers over the decades. As we are facing the multifaceted and very complex problems which transcends both the borders, you can talk about the climate change, you can talk about the terrorism, transnational crimes, trafficking. No single country, whatever, how much it is strong, cannot tackle those problems. That's why the multilateralism and those institutions are critically important. Though in some cases, bilateral dealing may be effective, but they can solve in the piecemeal basis. They cannot tackle the problems in comprehensive manner. So, though the way the globalization was interpreted was not problem-free, there were some concerns, reservations, and its own limitations. However, the alternative of the globalization is the better globalization. We cannot confine ourselves in this 21st century in petty national interest, which can jeopardize the broader public good.
I mean, I think that it's clear that all three panelists do see a future for more global cooperation, despite the challenges, or perhaps episodic challenges that we see today. At the same time, I would argue, or I would like to ask the panel, are there any benefits that have emerged from these tensions that might lead to changes being brought about that could have a positive impact on the geopolitical landscape?
Benefits?
Benefits of the rising tensions, of redefining relationships, of redefining power.
Well, I think that we cannot assume success. And that has sobered a number of political leaders into redoubling their efforts to deal with, frankly, some of the ways in which globalization has negatively affected our populations. Let's face it, the large corporations, the multinational corporations have done very well. Not all of the workers in our countries have appreciated and shared the benefits of globalization. And I do think one of the challenges, at least that we recognize in Canada, is we have to, in particular, have our SMEs find a way of plugging into the benefits of globalization, because small and medium-sized enterprises form such a large portion of our economic growth, and they have to see that there is a place for them in the networks of global business. It's not just the multilateral companies or multinational companies. So we have to pay more attention to the downside of globalization than we have.
I believe in the audience here, I wouldn't doubt that we have both multinational companies and some of those SMEs represented here. So please, when we do open for questions or comments, please do throw out your perspective from business. Any other thoughts on potential benefits of this renegotiating of the world order?
I would like to add one point. The only positive, if we can say it positive, is the growing challenges against the globalization. Multilateralism has created an environment to retrospect ourselves, to retrospect the development economic models we have pursued so far. There were shortcomings. They require reforms, and it have created immense pressure to reform those mistakes, shortcomings. But I cannot justify the unilateralism or protectionism, which, though it claims to solve the problem, but I doubt it.
Professor Jiang.
What are your...
Personally, I think the only benefit is that it triggers the thinking on the part of different countries. We have to think about the globalization as of now. And how can we adapt our individual policies to meet the challenges of globalization? For example, in China, we need to think about it again. How to expand our reform and opening up to meet the demand of globalization, which is really unprecedented now. This is something we are thinking. And I can see that in opening up and reform, we have been making more efforts. And this is on a bigger scale than in the past. So I think that is positive.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can open up to the audience very shortly. I think you can see that our panel is not focused only on the downsides of these shifts. There are many opportunities that emerge from the challenges that we're facing today. And in particular, I hope that in the conversation that follows, we'll be able to identify some areas of strategic cooperation that's still taking place outside of perhaps the main issues that we're episodically focusing on, whether it's trade or technology, security concerns. There are many, many areas where cooperation is taking place, and it's taking place in a very multi-stakeholder way, so business is heavily involved. Many government actors are involved at many different levels of government. It's not just at the national level, even at the state or city level. A lot of cooperation is taking place globally. So I do hope that in some of your questions or comments you have examples to share. So with that, I'd love to open up for questions. The microphone here. Yes.
Thank you. I'm a journalist from 21st Century Business Herald. My first question goes to Senator Harder. So do you admit that at this moment China and Canada have some difficulties, and what's your prospect for a way out and solution to solve this problem? And I also want to ask Foreign Minister, so what's your government's stance on China's Belt and Road Initiative? Do you face any pressure from Indian government to join this initiative? And maybe you can also give us some updates on the railway project between linking Tibet to your capital. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by acknowledging that the relationship between Canada and China is going through, at the political level, a period of some challenge because of the actions that Canada took to comply with our extradition treaty with the United States and some reactions that the government of China has taken with respect to Canadian nationals. I say this, though, in the context of a country about to celebrate, two countries about to celebrate the 50th year of diplomatic relations. A relationship in which Canada and China have, over those periods of diplomatic relations, strengthened their economic and people-to-people contacts. China is the second largest destination of Canadian exports. 1.8 million people in Canada claim China as their homeland, as the Mandarin as their mother tongue. I say that because we have long-standing and deep relationships, not just over these 50 years, but longer, and we will withstand them. I think the important thing is to recognize that we need to all, on both sides, work to resolve the immediate challenges while not making more difficult the ongoing person-to-person, sector-to-sector business and political and strategic relationships that we enjoy.
Yes, Nepal looks Belt and Road initiatives as a far-sighted initiative taken by President Xi. What fascinates us is its vision of shared future of the humanity and its perspective of the inclusive development. That is very, very important. That's why Nepal joined the BRI in 2017. Being a landlocked country, we extremely need the broader connectivity consisting railways, roadways, information ways, and many more. It can reduce our transportation cost, it can reduce production cost, and it can enhance the competitiveness in the global market. So that's why Nepal looks as a positive. we have no any that type of feeling of pressure from any side, because Nepal, as an independent country, takes independent decision, and we have the standpoint that it is a broader development perspective. So every corner should take it positively and take benefit from it.
I'm a journalist with the China Business Journal. My question is, how will the 3D printing change the global supply chain, trade, as well as the international political relationship? Do you have the plans for these changes? Thank you.
So perhaps maybe to reframe that question slightly in the context of something we've been talking about here at the forum now for almost 4 years, the fourth industrial revolution. So perhaps 3D printing is a big part of that distributed manufacturing, basically technological shifts and changes in global supply chains and value chains. Is technology, I could maybe ask, a big part of these geopolitical shifts as well, and in particular, new modes of manufacturing? How will that influence how geopolitical shifts play out, but also how populations within countries that are affected by these manufacturing shifts, how do they feel about globalization as a result?
Well, let me start. I think that that's a really important question, and it links to not just 3D printing, but the kind of issues that Rebecca, you raised, artificial intelligence and the like. And quite frankly, there are only certain things government can do in this regard. It's legal regimes, it's intellectual property, it's enhancing and investing in innovation. But the innovation takes place in the supply chains that are in the private sector. And how those supply chains are adjusted through breakthrough technologies is one that the marketplace has adjusted to in the past and will continue to adjust to. For a country like Canada, we are part of that common economic space of North America. As challenging as the renegotiation of the NAFTA has been, that is the first area of economic space. But we are also the only G7 country to have a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. And that gives us the platform for economic interactions and supply chain management that is unique for Canada. The challenge now is to ensure that the investments that are made in innovation and in the application of artificial intelligence have a hub, a link in Canada. And that's where the government of Canada in particular has invested significantly in raw research, talent development, human capital, because the subjects that we're dealing with are all about exploiting human innovation.
Professor Jiang.
I would say this is a very good question because we're faced with a new revolution of technologies, and such changes would have profound impact on the entire human community. Science and technology is one of the most important productive factors. When the world economy is in the era of changing from old driver to new drivers, so such an industrial revolution would impact global industrial chain, value chain, or even global economic prosperity. This would be a great opportunity for all countries to upgrade your industrial structure, especially for the developing countries, because technology treats all countries in an equal way. In a certain perspective, all countries goes back to the same starting line. With these opportunities, developing countries, emerging economies would enjoy even better potential. But there's something people need to take care. Technology is a driving force for human society or civilization. It is a common tool. It is a common driving force. We should not adopt a Cold War mindset or a competitive mindset. Countries should work with each other for a win-win result. That is the best target we can have, because we want to benefit all countries, every individual. I would say that should be our ultimate goal.
I imagine that without a doubt, everyone in the room hopes and believes that technology can play a very positive role. I wonder, Professor Jiang, if I could ask you a follow-up question about that technological shift. Do you believe that technology, from a Chinese people's perspective, would ever pose a similar kind of concern or concern about future livelihoods, concern about transformations that are too rapid for people to keep up with? Would this ever influence the Chinese people's perception of geopolitical shifts and China's position in the world?
I would say rapid development of technology brought most obvious change in China in the economic arena. If you talk about geopolitics landscape, taking the Chinese perspective, I wouldn't say technology would play a major role. For example, in the past year, there's a rapid development of the shared economy with the internet or AI or other emerging industries. This brings people more convenience. It facilitates our life, improved our life quality. So the most obvious change brought by technology is on the economic arena, but limited arena from the geopolitical side. Or up to now, we do not feel it strongly, as long as there is no Cold War mindset. Technology would benefit not only Chinese people, but people from every country in the world.
So I'm aware that we have less than 5 minutes to go, so we have a chance for one more quick question here.
Thank you very much. My name is James Cockayne. I'm from the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. That's a UN think tank in New York. I wanted to pick up on the previous question and Zhang Laoshu's reference twice now to Cold War mindset. It seems to me that this is not just a question of an industrial revolution, but of an information revolution. The new technologies we've been talking about upstairs allow companies and countries to reach across each other's borders and put information into the political space, take information out of the political space in ways that go well beyond supply chain reorganization. So I wanted to ask, if that's correct, my characterization, what impact does that have on the geopolitical system? Our geopolitical system assumes the territorial integrity of each country. Are the technologies we've been talking about upstairs, 5G and technologies like that, are they going to rewrite the rules of the geopolitical system internationally, or need we not fear?
So I'm going to take advantage of that question to be my last question to the panel as well, because we will wrap up in about 3 minutes. So if I can ask each of you to maybe give your 1-minute answer. Minister, let's start with you.
Technology should be developed as a common asset of the humankind, which can contribute to make life easier. And that should not be a question of unnecessary contention. We should create such a conducive environment where new technologies can blossom, and we should develop to affordable manner so that every society can take the benefit of that technology. So trends are not so welcoming nowadays, but what we looked at, if we connect the life of the people to the technology, and if we take the people in the center, then such type of unnecessary controversies can be reduced. Yeah.
So if I were to summarize that in one sentence, I would say that your area of strategic cooperation that we could look forward to is in the area of how to better share ways to connect technology to people's lives.
Yes.
Senator.
The dystopian future that you articulate is one that I think nation states will resist, and rightly so in my view, in the sense that we have every intention of ensuring that in our country, for example, we're about to have an election, that the election isn't fraudulently or technology isn't abused in a fashion which undermines the expression of the ballot box. I think similarly, countries will want to have the assurances of privacy protection, of appropriate use of technology. Yes, I agree with you about the technology and the platform needs to be more broadly shared, but this is not a beast that we will all worship. This is a platform that has to have the integrity and the transparency that has, at least thus far, not won the confidence of the public. And I think that's job one for the technology companies.
Perfect. So another area of strategic cooperation, but particularly to those who perhaps aren't in government, but who can bring in their expertise to how to formulate a data privacy or a technology use policy and principles that can be acceptable to all. Professor Jiang.
Well, I would say technology should benefit human society and facilitate people's life. That is the most important thing. Here in China, as you know, we're looking for a shared future of mankind. I would say it is a win-win mindset. That is the concept of Chinese leaders and among all walks of life of Chinese. Why I frequently mention the Cold War mindset? Because I have been dedicated to study of international relations. I do feel that in many countries' impression between China and Western countries, there is a gap. The gap cannot be easily overcome, and that gap is somewhat a showcase of the Cold War mindset, and that impact our cooperation in terms of technology and many other areas. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I were to try to lastly summarize another area of strategic cooperation that could be highlighted from what you just shared, it's perhaps how to cooperate on developing a new narrative so that we aren't forced to decide between the dichotomy of a Cold War mindset or a mindset where we believe that the current, what some describe as a liberal order, is the perfect one that accommodates the desires and the needs of all the different countries today. So perhaps working together on a new narrative, one that's more realistic and pragmatic, but also still vision-driven and values-oriented. So certainly a challenge for all of you, and I hope that you won't leave that just to governments to handle, but that you yourself will be part of shaping that narrative in your discussions here over these 3 days and build some of those bridges that may appear to be lost at a high level, but seem to be still very strong amongst all of you. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank our panelists as well.